What's the first favorite mistake story that you'd like to share, Shaun?
Well, when we started in '89, I bought my partner in '92, and many of your listeners who are in business for themselves can relate to this. But if they have anything to know about banking, it's hard for banks to realize. But in 9 years, we grew 50-fold. That's just unheard of. And so along the way, one of the key things I learned, and I think this goes across all businesses, is that IT is for the little guy, because it's, to have big investments in systems, and there's a lot of off the shelf things you can do that solve problems. And so we brought in an IT guy in '93 after I'd failed at buying the bank he was with. And things were just unbelievable the next years. We did things that the big banks couldn't do. And then in 1995, he had personal issues and said, I'm moving to Florida. And he said, my lieutenant can hold this together for about a year, but you need to find someone. So the long and the short of it was, he was right. About a year later, the good news is we found a woman who I just think walks on water. The bad news is it took a whole year. And so she got there in August, and I said, Kim, we're going to do whatever you want to do, because I saw what Jim was able to do for us over about 2.5 years, and I trust you. So she came back in about 6 weeks and said, we need to do this. And for us, it was $1.7 million investment, which was a lot of money. And this was in November. And she said, and it'll be done the next November. I said, okay. I went to the board about 2 weeks later. We approved it. Well, in my mind, it's solved. Being an entrepreneur, there it goes. Well, here's where my mistake kicks in. So she said, there's one thing, Shaun, you can't buy another bank between now and next November. Well, Mark, that went in this ear and out the other ear. Yeah. In March, I got a chance to buy one. And she said, Shaun, you can't do that. And I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to.
Sorry to interrupt, but why was she saying that? It would cause problems with the IT implementation? Well,
and this is what I didn't realize till we get to September. This is when I learned my lesson. It truly was a mistake that, oh my gosh, when I tell you the mathematical error in it, you'll get the magnitude. What she was saying was, first, we're buying all this hardware and software. Second, we have to train people for months. Then it takes weeks to install it and train them in using it, and then we turn it all on. So it wasn't like, my mind is, you went to the store, you bought a program, you came home, you popped it in your computer, and a few hours later you were playing ball. And it didn't work that way. So in March, when I bought this bank, I said, Kim, no problem. Here's what we'll do. I won't merge it in till next March, because it was small. It was only 30 million. It was about 20th our size at that time. And so that calmed her down, and we made it through that. Well, we get to May, and in St. Louis, what's now U.S. Bank made a big acquisitions of a savings and loan, and the Federal Trade Commission made them divest. And we were a $600 million bank, and we were borrowing $100 million overnight, which is not a good resolution for a business. It'd be like a company saying, I need a sixth of my balance sheet, and I want it on demand, meaning the bank can agree not to renew it the next day. And all of a sudden, I could buy $100 million in deposits. And the price was right. It was two markets we weren't in. And Kim said, Shaun, it's going to be a problem. Now, she had only been there about 9 months. So she didn't really have the ability to communicate the level of magnitude of problem. As an entrepreneur, a problem's no problem. So we signed a contract, and the announcement came Memorial Day weekend. We had to close Labor Day weekend. So Labor Day weekend, I go to all these banks on that Friday afternoon. That weekend, we have a great zoo in St. Louis for people who've never been here. It's one of the best in the world. And so I take my kids to the zoo, and my debit card doesn't work. And it doesn't really resonate, okay, no big deal. Well, by the time I got by Tuesday, a bank in those days would close at 2:00 and then start a new day. What that meant is you started processing. In most banks, we were considered a large bank and not a huge bank like we became, but we would start processing at 2:00 and we'd be done around 7:00. Well, these banks we bought had so many transaction accounts. They took us from 2:00 till noon the next day to process.
No, whoops.
Yeah. And so what happened Memorial Day, so this is going on. And by the middle of that week, we figured out that if you went to a bank and cashed a check, our bank, or if you went to one of our ATMs, we didn't capture it. There was no what's called on us. So therein lies the mistake and I had all kinds of people who call me up the month later and said, Shaun, I got $250 and you never charged my account. But $1,547,000 walked out the door that weekend that we couldn't find.
Oh my gosh.
Now, two pieces of that, and then I'll get to the mistake that I found in it was one, that year we made about 6 million after tax. So it was about 20% of our 16% of our after tax earnings. Our earnings, we were public, were up over 20% that year. No one noticed. And if you read the annual report, it was so buried in the footnotes, but I'll never forget $1,549,000. The lesson in it and the mistake was that week I wanted to fire someone. I went crazy. By the way, I didn't mention Kim managed to have a child during this period. We had to set up in a hospital room a computer system because that wasn't the days when you had laptops that did what they did now. And that whole week, I'm screaming, we have to fire someone. We have to hold someone accountable. And by the end of the week, I went back to my management team and I said, I figured out who it is. It's me. And when you say your mistake, it was my mistake. It was my mistake not to listen. It was my mistake not to understand. It was my mistake to buy this, as important acquisition it was. And all this rested on me. But it's so easy, especially in our culture today, to look for someone to blame. And as I learned from that at the end of the day, you know, you're the person at the top. It's your child. That's what I call my company. You're the one responsible. And that was an unbelievable lesson in making a very expensive mistake because 3 years before we didn't make $1,547,000 pre-tax, you know. So it was the magnitude of the loss, and it was just how quick it disappeared. And then really what it did was it sucked the life out of our culture for about a year. For a year, we were a different company. Now, what we did in that year was we made a lot of tough decisions. We consolidated. We did some things that we would never have done. So I would say the mistake, you always have to remember, and I think Harry Truman had the thing on his desk, the buck stops here. It stops with the CEO. And that's the one lesson. The other lesson is when you make a mistake like that, what can you do with it? And in our case, we sold some things that didn't fit. We spun some businesses off. We did things, and we didn't really grow for 1 year, which was ironic for us as much as we grew in that 9-year span, but we made more money and we were a better company. So good came from it, but the mistake was horrific.